So we picked up last time with these two valuation techniques, cost of illness method and replacement cost method. For the cost of illness method, we have observed payments for medical services, medical bills, doctor's visits, hospitalizations, things like that. We have observable information about lost days of work, and we have information about average wages, and so we can estimate some kind of the losses in productivity and the loss of production that occurred because of fewer days of work. And that is a lower bound. That's at least a minimum of what the costs of some disease or some pollution hazard is, because we observe people paying at least that much for treatment, but we don't know exactly how much they'd be willing to pay in order to completely have to not have had to go through that experience at all. And so these cost of illness figures, they don't account for the kind of the inconvenience and maybe the pain and suffering that goes into some of these hazards or these diseases. And so it's a lower bound. It doesn't capture everything. It doesn't capture all maybe the psychological toll that it takes or the emotional toll that it takes on you, but it does at least represent a minimum on what you'd be willing to pay to alleviate some of the effects of the disease or the condition. Similar thing with the replacement costs. It's a lower bound. Again, it's like we know that whatever natural environment that we would preserve, for example, in upstate New York, we know that natural environment at least is as valuable as the capital costs that we're able to avoid, because we have those forests and those riparian buffers and those wetlands acting as water purification mechanisms, which can replace and it can allow us to avoid having to spend money on expensive wastewater treatment facilities. And those wetlands and forests and riparian buffers may have value on top of that, but we know that it's at least as valuable as the capital goods that we can avoid having to pay for because of the services that those pieces of natural capital provide to us. We'll get into a couple more methods later on. I do want to just talk about briefly just kind of an important distinction. When we're thinking about non-market valuation, it's important to distinguish between willingness to pay and willingness to accept. These are the measures of welfare that we have. We don't really have any other way to do brain scans. So the only real thing we have is what they'd be willing to pay, maybe to have an improvement in their conditions, or what they'd be willing to accept to maybe to deal with some kind of reduction in the quality of their lives. So it's based on this idea of, it's basically all we have to do, because we can't directly observe people's brains. It's based on this idea of compensation. Essentially, it's looking at because we can't measure well-being directly, but we can figure out, we can find 2 points at which people are indifferent. We can say that someone has an indifference point. They're perfectly indifferent between their current environmental quality and the amount of income they have, and they're indifferent between between that and a higher level of environmental quality and a little bit less income. So you're trading off. In one case, you have higher income, less environmental quality. In another case, you have higher environmental quality and lower income. And if you adjust that income level, if you adjust that monetary value, that's sort of compensating them, and you can find the point at which they're perfectly indifferent between having a little bit more environmental quality and being willing to give up a little bit of extra income. That's kind of the only welfare measure, the only real welfare measure that we have, given that well-being itself is very difficult to define and measure at all. So the two kinds of measures we have then are willingness to pay and willingness to accept. And there's a difference between them. So unfortunately, they're not exactly identical. One way in which they're different is that willingness to pay is implicitly framing the issue as they do not have the property rights to the environmental quality, and they have to pay in order to acquire it. They have to give something up in order to get an improvement in their circumstances. In the other case, in the willingness to accept framing, the way that that's framed, they have the property rights and they have control over what happens. They have veto power over what happens, and they have to be compensated in exchange for being willing to endure a little bit of a reduction in whatever environmental quality or whatever reduction in their circumstances that you're trying to value. So it's a difference in terms of whether the property rights are implied to be with the person already in case of willingness to accept. They have the property rights and they have to be paid to give them up, or whether or not they do not have the property rights and they have to pay. They have to give up some of their own money to acquire those rights, right? So that's going to imply different things for willingness to pay based on income and wealth effects. So if we remember from microeconomics, one of the things that matters for how much of a good that you demand of something, what your quantity demanded is going to depend on what your income is. That income was one of the factors that affected. That was one of the factors that shifted the demand curve. That affected how much you might be willing to pay for something at a given price. And so, whether or not you have the property rights to an environmental good or service, that actually is going to imply a different level of wealth. If you don't have the property rights, it's as if your endowment is smaller, and so it's almost like your income is a little bit smaller, and that could potentially affect what you're willing to pay, because if you have lower income, you might be willing to pay not be willing to pay as much for some good or service compared to a scenario where you have more income. Whereas if you have the property rights, that's as if your endowment is larger. That's as if your wealth is larger, and you have more freedom to be able to convert that into something else if you want to. You have more disposable income available to you if the property rights to the clean environment are implied to belong to you. So there are different wealth and income implications for whether the value of environmental quality is framed as willingness to pay or willingness to accept. One particular way in which that matters is it's related to this, but maybe you might even think of this as a slightly distinct feature of these different measures. But willingness to pay is bounded by income. It has an upper bound at your income level. You can't physically be willing to pay more than you have. Whereas willingness to accept, in theory, there is no limit to what you might be willing to accept. You can basically say any number, and we would just have to take your word for it, because we don't know. We're not inside your head. We don't know what actual benefits you get from that, and maybe it is worth $1 billion to you, but you have no way of actually putting your own money down. So it's a little bit perhaps less credible than a willingness to pay measure. That's one important way in which those two measures are different from one another. And then it's a little bit it's similar, but it's not exactly the same. But there's something called an endowment effect, which is not the same as an income or wealth effect. It's more of a psychological phenomenon. So psychologists and behavioral economists have observed this effect in the lab when they give somebody a gift, and then they ask how much they'd be willing to accept to have that gift taken away from them, versus they show them something, the same gift, maybe to a different group of people, and ask them how much they would be willing to pay to get that, like a mug, for example. And people, systematically, people will always have a higher value for willingness to accept than willingness to pay. And the belief, at least the consensus among psychologists and behavioral economists, is that there's some kind of psychological attachment to something that you already own. When something is already yours, your perspective has changed, and all of a sudden your state of mind is that is rightfully yours, that rightfully belongs to you, and you feel a greater attachment to it, and you feel like it would be wrong for that thing to be taken away from you. Whereas something that you don't own yet, even if it looks good, you don't own it yet, and so you don't have the same level of attachment to it, and you might not be willing to pay for that to get that good as much as you would be hurt if you were to have that taken away from you after you already own it. It's a little bit of a loss aversion tendency in human beings to value to feel more significantly the effect of losses of things that we previously had relative to the gains we get by, or the happiness we get from being able to get something that we didn't have initially. So that's the endowment effect, which is, again, it's kind of a psychological effect, a little bit different than a purely economic effect. It's kind of more of a function of some of our psychology and cognitive processes. So this will come in a little bit later when we talk about stated preference techniques. Some of the other techniques, two of the other techniques that we're going to talk about are called revealed preference and stated preference methods. Those are two broad classes of techniques, and we'll talk about some subcategories of revealed preference. But in general, these two techniques differ from one another in the following way. Revealed preference techniques relate to actual purchases of some kind of good or service, or actual expenditure of either time, money, effort, something like that, where you're actually having to put forth some kind of, you have some stake in what's happening, you have some actual personal cost to you based on what you're consuming. With stated preferences, these are kind of indirect ways of eliciting willingness to pay or accept for different kinds of non-market goods. So with revealed preference, these are all different kinds of things that are traded directly in market. So if, for example, if a park has an access fee, or if a state park or a national park has an access fee, and we can observe you paying that money to get into the park, that's a revealed preference. That's like us, the researcher, being able to see that this visit to the park was worth at least as much to you as the cost of entry, because you have to actually put some money down and you are getting to actually go visit the site directly. With stated preference techniques, it's all kind of hypothetical. The questions center around hypothetical scenarios where the researcher might ask, if environmental quality was improved by X amount, or if you had access to a natural area near your house that was within 5 or 10 miles that had such and such amenities, hiking trails, etc. The question would be framed as, if that existed, what would be your willingness to pay to have that thing exist? And one of the advantages of that is it actually lets you put values on all kinds of goods and services that would be impossible to value otherwise. So if we go back to this taxonomy of values, a lot of these things are non-market. Some of these are market goods, like the timber and the wildlife films. Those are directly traded in markets. But things like the option value, or the bequest value, or the existence value, especially non-use values, those are not directly traded in markets at all. And so the only ways that we could possibly have to quantify those would be to ask people what they might be willing to pay to have access to that resource in order for the option to exist, or to have the ability to pass it on to your kids and grandkids and future generations, or to just know that it exists. Maybe you get some pleasure from knowing it exists. There's no markets for existence. There's no ability to buy and sell in the existence of things, because it's not excludable. It's also non-rival, and there's no way for a well-functioning market to emerge for that. So we have to, if we want to actually estimate the values on things like existence, what people are willing to pay for the existence of resources or different amenities, the only way we can do that is by just asking them basic questions about what they might be willing to pay or accept. So that's a stated preference. So it gives you access to valuing a much wider range of of goods and services that don't exist in markets, that aren't valued in markets. But the problem with them is that the problem with stated preference relative to reveal preference is that you don't have anything at stake. You don't have anything that you stand to lose by stating a number on what you'd be willing to pay. And it's hypothetical. You don't have experience necessarily in just answering questions about what's the maximum that you'd be willing to pay for something. You do have experience going to the store, looking at the shelves and figuring out whether you prefer this or that, and deciding to take something off the shelf and put it in your cart. But that's not something that we do, paying for the existence of things, or stating what we would be willing to pay for the existence of things. And the fact that there's nothing at stake, there's no actual sense in which we're having to give something up, that can introduce some problems in terms of making those estimates based on the stated preference. That can introduce some issues for making the stated preference techniques a little bit invalid if they're not done correctly. And even if they are done correctly, there's always questions about the validity of them. Whereas with revealed preference techniques, you always know that whoever has been spending money on these things at least is bearing some personal cost, and that itself lends some credibility to whether or not they were willing to pay for the thing itself, because we actually observe them actually paying for that thing itself. So revealed preference is great when we have data on things that exist that are related to perhaps the non-market goods that we would like to value. But some of that data doesn't exist for every type of use. Just like in the taxonomy, there's non-use values. There's not good data on what people are willing to pay for non-use values, because there's no markets for those things. So the best we can do in that case is use something like a stated preference method. So I'll get into each of these in a little bit more detail, starting right now, effective immediately. So the first revealed preference method I want to just go over quickly is called the travel cost method. So the way this works is there's a particular site, some kind of park or lake or forest, and there's some kind of zone. There's maybe some zones around the park in terms of different areas where people live, or different distances where people live relative to that park. So we might have people in zone A that live very close to the park, and then maybe that's like within a 5 or 10 mile radius. Maybe people in zone B which live a little further away, maybe that's a 10 to 30 mile radius. And then maybe there's people in zone C which are maybe a 50 to 100 mile radius. So they have a long distance to get to that site. People from zone B have a slightly shorter distance to get to that site, and then people from zone A would have the shortest distance of all to get to that site. Effectively, what we can do as a environmental economists and as researchers is we can use the fact that different people have different travel costs of getting to a site. We can use that information to almost like act as a price on the site. Even if there's no access fee for the site, people are having to spend gas and just basic maintenance costs on their vehicle. Every mile you drive puts a little bit more wear and tear on your car. It makes you have to change your oil a little bit more frequently the more you drive. It makes you have to replace parts more frequently. So there's sort of a sense in which vehicle operating and maintenance costs are going to be much greater for having to take a longer trip. Some of that's fuel, some of that's just operating costs and maintenance costs. Some of it is going to be the cost of your time. Some of it's going to be the opportunity cost of your time. What you could be doing with your time. Maybe if you were working, you could be earning a certain amount of money, or using your time in some other way. So you're giving up your time to get to that site and maybe take a trip and visit that park or that lake. maybe there is explicitly an access fee where you have to pay a fee to actually enter the park for a day. Maybe there's a fee for being able to rent a campground to have a place where you can pitch your tent for the night or for multiple nights. In that case, all of those costs are expenditures that fall upon you to visit that site. So you have to actually fork over that money to make that site visit. And so you are revealing, that's why it's revealed preference, you are revealing through your behavior that site is worth at least as much to you as all of the fuel costs, the maintenance costs on your vehicle, the time, the access fee or the fee for renting a campground. You're revealing that site is worth at least as much to you as all those expenses you had to make in order to get there. So that's effectively like a price. We can treat that as if that's like a price of the visit, and we can exploit or we can use to our advantage the fact that there's variations in price for different people. People from zone A have a much shorter distance to get there than people from zone B or C, and so they would be more likely to visit the park more frequently than people in zone B and C. And so one of the things that lets us do is almost artificially here construct some kind of demand curve for this non-market good, this park, which maybe isn't directly traded in markets. So we have some we have some observations. So one of the ways this might work is you have a researcher or one of your research assistants go and survey people when they come into a park or some recreational site, and they'll ask questions like, what's your, how far did you have to travel, or maybe not explicitly that, maybe they'll ask like, what zip code did you come from, and that gives information about the distance that you had to travel to get there. You might look at what kind of car they have, and that would give you some kind of information about what their vehicle fuel costs and operating costs are for the kind of vehicle they have. You might ask them other questions about maybe why they visited, maybe open-ended questions about like what features of the site were attractive to them in their visit, what kind of alternatives did they have for visiting that park, did they have other sites that were close by that they could have visited instead. All of that data can be kind of used to construct a demand curve where on the one axis, on the x-axis, you have frequency of visits. So, number of visits, maybe on the x-axis, and then the travel cost on the y-axis. That's like the price. In effect, that's the price. And so frequency is going to, you collect data on various people who have visited that site, and we get different travel costs, and we observe that people from different zones may visit the site at different frequencies, and we can kind of take that data and we can fit a line through it. We can kind of find a line that fits through the data as best as possible, and that can be our demand curve. So this now becomes kind of a artificial or synthetic demand curve for this area, whether it's a park, maybe it's a national park or a state park, or a beach, or just some kind of hiking trail. And we can use this travel cost to kind of artificially create a demand curve. And then if just like in the market valuation, the way that we valued goods and markets was through consumer and producer surplus. We needed demand curves and supply curves to estimate that. Demand curves let us estimate what the benefits are to the use of a resource. If we have a demand curve, we could say that if people from zone B, maybe people from zone B have a particular travel cost, and we observe that on average, the average household from zone B, takes takes X amount of visits, then the essentially the area above the demand curve that we construct, the artificial demand curve that we construct, that area can represent the consumer surplus, given that they have some travel costs that they have to expend to get there, and if we know how many visits they take, that can let us put some estimate on the consumer surplus that they get from that site. So that's the travel cost method. So the hedonic pricing method is, again, it's a revealed preference method. It's a revealed preference technique, and it uses the fact that a lot of market goods we buy are kind of bundled together with different environmental amenities. And one classic example of this is a house. So when you buy a house, you're buying a house that has a certain amount of bedrooms. It has a certain size. It has a certain square footage. It has a certain number of bathrooms. It has a certain neighborhood which has a certain level of school quality, right? And all these factors are kind of bundled together inside of a house that you purchase, and all of these things will sort of factor into the price of the house. But there's also things that come with the house, such as whether or not the house is downwind from an industrial plant that increases the ambient air pollution in the area. So if you buy a particular house that is downwind or is in an area of town that has a lot of industrial activity with a lot of particulate matter being spewed into the air nearby, the house that you buy is actually an implicit purchase of some kind of air quality. And that's also going to be factoring into the price that you have to pay. And if you have data on the houses that have been bought and sold, a lot of that data is publicly available on Zillow or Trulia or other things like that, other marketing sites like that. You can see when the recent sales of some of these houses are and the price that they sold for. And you can observe, the number of bedrooms, the number of bathrooms, how large it is, what kind of neighborhood it's in. You can sort of compare. You can look at comparable houses. Maybe one house is in a part of town that's in an industrial zone, which is downwind from some of the smokestacks that are spewing out a lot of particulate matter that sort of reduce the air quality in that area. You can look at a house that's in an area like that with kind of poor air quality, and you can compare it to a house that has, a similar number of bedrooms, similar number of bathrooms, similar size, and you can look at maybe what the premium is for a house that has a little bit better air quality. And that's an implicit way that we can get to the price, in a sense, the price of air quality. We can get to it indirectly through the prices that we observe people paying in terms of the houses that they want to buy, and that's sort of an implicit purchase of air quality. That's very helpful because it's somebody that is actually putting their own money on the line. They're actually making a sacrifice themselves. They're revealing through their behavior that they value air quality in terms of the home that they're purchasing, and there's readily available data on that. That's very easy to that data is very easy to get, and so you can construct estimates based on these things like house prices. One of the drawbacks, however, is that people have to know that people have to have good information about the quality of the environmental good that they're buying. So if for example there's like some kind of environmental hazard in one area versus another, but people don't know that it exists, and it's only later on that we find out that there's some contamination in the groundwater or some toxic waste that's affecting people's health in one area or another. That has to be known. So it has to be the case in order for this hedonic pricing to work, there has to be information on the part of the consumers and the home purchasers on the environmental quality. If there's not information that's known, then people can't be making these housing purchase decisions based on those environmental quality measures because they don't know about them. But for measures of environmental quality that are related to purchases like houses, it's a very nice way to look at the complementary goods that people are purchasing, like houses. Look at the prices of complementary goods and see how the price premium, how that exists for certain goods with higher air quality, for example, relative to other comparable goods, other houses that have less air quality, even though they have comparable characteristics in other ways. So that's kind of an overview of the hedonic pricing method. Again, it's a revealed preference method, which lets you put an estimate on some of these environmental goods and services that are otherwise hard to evaluate. Okay, so the last revealed preference method that I'm going to go through in detail is called the defensive expenditures approach to non-market valuation. Sometimes this is called averting behavior. This is essentially looking at when an environmental kind of hazard comes into being, what are people willing to pay themselves in order to take some kinds of defensive measures against that reduction in their environmental quality or their resource quality. How are people mitigating the effects of the environmental hazard themselves? What are they paying with their own money to mitigate the effects of that? So one way to make this concrete is if there's some kind of industrial accident which contaminates the water supply for a particular town, what you might observe is you have this accident which diminishes the water quality. Water quality goes down, and then maybe you observe that households, you start to see that they buy more bottled water than they otherwise would, in order to they can't drink the tap water, and so they're buying more bottled water. And you could estimate that through maybe actually just surveying the households and asking them survey questions about, like, given that this water resource has been damaged, what have been your additional expenditures of bottled water above and beyond what you would have bought before, which you've taken? What's the value of those extra expenditures you've made in response to this hazard that you've had to endure? So you might do this in the form of a survey that has been done before by researchers in this area. Another way you could do it, I had a colleague who actually was looking at grocery purchase data and comparing purchases of bottled water among households that were in close proximity to a shale gas well, where there was drilling for shale gas in Pennsylvania, and looking at how the differences in purchases changed after a new well was put in place relative to what they were before. So you have some kind of baseline bottled water purchases that you would expect to be there just in the first place. People, for whatever reason, buy some amount of bottled water anyway, but they might increase their bottled water consumption and purchases above and beyond what they otherwise would, based on the fact that some of their tap water has been contaminated or compromised. And that can happen even if there's no direct proof that the water has been contaminated. If people perceive that there's been some risk to their water quality, if people perceive that it's been harmed, that might actually still be some kind of harm to them if they perceive it that way, and they end up changing their behavior and taking on additional expenditures that they otherwise wouldn't take on. So that's another way of getting at willingness to pay for avoiding some kind of environmental harm, is thinking about what measures, what's the expenditures that households are taking themselves on these kinds of things to avoid the costs of that reduction in environmental quality.